Well, hi, welcome to our webinar this morning. This is Rob, and we're going to get into this issue about is there one best way to lead, or is that something that's variable? And we'll dig into that because it's a subject that I spent a lot of time with over the last 20 plus years, and I want to share some things with you. So thanks for joining in. Hey, post questions as we go, and I'll get to all of them at the end of the webinar. Every question I'll answer to the best of my ability. So the questions we're going to deal with, is there one quote best way to lead? Is best leadership unique to each organization? Does what's best change over time? We're going to get into all those things and obviously relate to each other. And I just want to give you my perspective on with some real world perspectives and experiences, both positives and negatives, to help illuminate these questions and how I've dealt with them over the years. If you're interested in leadership development, I think these are important questions to answer because, in my experience, they're just completely germane to being able to really address the most critical things that need to be dealt with in leadership development. And I think the answer to these questions have a strong bearing on how much value an organization gets out of the investment they put in leadership development. Now, my opinions on these questions, based on the people I've talked to and the things I read online, like I'm sure you guys do, are really almost the polar opposite of how most people involved in leadership development think. But my opinions on this subject have really evolved over time because, as I'm going to tell you later on in this webinar, my opinions have evolved, quite frankly, because of some failures. I'm going to describe to you a client situation where, in retrospect, I led a client on a really wrong path. And then, thank God, shortly after that, I got exposed to some thinking from one of the best business thinkers I've ever encountered. And based on the things that I read about this person, maybe the best business thinker of one of them in the last 100 years, it just opened my mind to a completely different way to approach leadership development. I want to share that with you guys because it's the core of everything about the leadership development work I've done over the last 20 plus years. But because of the point of view that I've come across that is so different than the way most leadership development gets done, is I think most leadership development is quite ineffective. And that belief is supported by some research that I've come across that well over half of CEOs are dissatisfied with the leadership development investment. And one study pegs that figure as high as 93%. And that really gets my attention. 55%, that's one thing. Almost 100% dissatisfaction. It's like, wow, we have to do better. And I believe we can do better, but how can we do that? So very briefly, who am I and why is it worthwhile listening to me on this webinar? I've been a management consultant since 1985. I was a principal at Mercer for 15 years until 2000, at which point I started a consulting company, Inside Out Solutions, and then back in 2012 founded another company, Consult from Strength. And Inside Out Solutions it's a consulting firm, and we work with organizations on leadership development, business planning, business problem solving, things of that nature. And then Consult from Strength was formed to license and train consultants and OD professionals to use our proprietary leadership development process, a lot of which I'm going to talk to you about today. You'll have some exposure to what that's all about. So let's start this by looking at those first two questions. Is there one best way to lead, and is best leadership unique to each organization? And I used to believe that the answer to the first question was yes, there was one best way to lead. and the answer to the second question was no. It isn't unique organization to organization. Leadership is leadership, and there's a right way to do it. I believe there's one best way to lead, and I believe I knew what it was. It was because I created it. I created my own model of best leadership. And it was a hybrid of some of the most current academic thinking at the time and some very ancient Taoist philosophy. And the current stuff was two guys at Harvard, Ron Heifetz and Don Laurie, back in 1987 in a Harvard Business Review article, wrote something that really got my attention. Well, that's really cool stuff. And I've been doing some studying myself on Taoism, and John Heider had written a book called The Tao of Leadership, and I was reading that, and I saw connections between those two things. And I thought, oh, here's a way to deal with a frustration I had. I was doing a lot of change work with clients, but they weren't implementing very well. And I was like, what's wrong with the implementation of these change efforts? And I thought, hey, maybe it's the issue that leadership isn't good enough to affect the change. So I should work on improving leadership. Now, you can probably start to see, when I told you earlier about this wrong path, I let a client down, you can probably start to get a sense of that wrong path right now. But I thought I had the answer. And I thought it was a great answer. And so did a CEO I had a client in a pretty large national restaurant chain. And I talked to that CEO about, hey, John, I think there's a way to really turbocharge the way this organization operates by teaching leaders to be more effective. And I ran that model I built by John, and he was like, I'm in. And so we went to teach that model to all the leaders. And it was really well received by corporate people, by district manager of the restaurant, and it seemed by all accounts to be fantastic. And so that went really well. And then a couple of months later, I had sold another project to a 2-hospital healthcare system to teach them my leadership model. But before we started that second project, I got exposed to some work from Peter Drucker and Tom Patterson. And in the context of the business planning work that I was doing, and basically just a light bulb went off for me. And Peter Drucker is probably familiar to you, is considered the father of modern management theory. And his consulting partner is Tom Patterson. And these two guys, especially Tom, in my experience, when I say one of the best thinkers on business in the last 100 years, Peter's certainly that, and I think Tom is right there with him. And we began to learn some things from those guys about the way to approach change in an organization. And the essence of their work was that the key to transforming anything in an organization is that tremendous power that's created when a management team develops their own solutions and does not outsource those solutions to an outside expert. And we went away Tom had this retreat in Big Bear, California, up in the mountains. And my business partner and I went to spend a couple of weeks with Tom, just full bore, getting fully immersed in the way he would approach this collaborative process of taking the intrinsic collective wisdom of a given organization and using that to solve business problems or build business plans. So we're listening to this with Tom, and we're deeply engaged with him. And then I got smacked upside the head with a realization, right? It was like, well, I'm pretty stupid, but I'm not completely unaware of what's going on. And I said, Tom, is there a way to take this approach where you take the wisdom inside an organization and pull out the answer to their problems from them, as opposed to being the consultant telling them what to do? Could we apply that to leadership development? And Tom said, I've always wanted to try to approach leadership, but I've never quite figured out how to do it. And I think, yeah, it could work. It could actually work. And it hit me that my approach to leadership development, the thing I was doing with that restaurant chain, which by all accounts at the time was going great, the thing that I had sold to this 2-hospital healthcare system, was fundamentally wrong. It was just a complete wrong approach. And it got me thinking that maybe there's a different way to approach the whole thing. And so I went to that hospital CEO, and before we ever started the project, and did something that was taboo in a large consulting company. Because at that time, I wasn't in my own firm. I was in one of the biggest consulting firms in the world. And I did something that you're never supposed to do. I unsold the project. And I went to the CEO and I said, hey, the thing that we really want to do together, I think there's a better way. And I described Tom Patterson's approach of, as opposed to teaching you my model for leadership, let's go through a collaborative process with your people, and let's pull their model, your intrinsic model, out of you to create this ownership And that guy, he loved the concept. And we used that fully collaborative approach to build that unique model and change that organization. And so what's completely different there than the way I used to view leadership development is that there is no one best way to lead. What's best is what that organization believes is best for them. Because with that buy-in, with that ownership, comes change. And as smart as I might have thought I was as a consultant with my model, my Harvard Taoist model, it was still pushing my perspective on somebody else. And even if they bought it for a while, at some point in time, they start to fade away from it because it's not theirs and you don't get implementation. And so the original frustration I had, which got me into leadership development, which is why won't my clients implement the change efforts that we're doing, is I was creating the exact same frustrating dynamic of leadership development by pushing my thing on them that they didn't own and ultimately wouldn't fully implement. So what happened in those two organizations that proved this theory that there is no best way to do it and things are unique to each organization? And this gets to the wrong path I sent a client down, is that first organization had a few months of really energetic conversation and observable change. But after about 6 months, that momentum was lost. The energy faded. And they went right back to the basically uninspired, stagnant leadership they had that got the CEOs engaged with me to say, yeah, let's try to change things. And it got so bad that CEO was pushed out of the organization by some investors. The organization eventually had great real estate. It was a great restaurant chain. They had beautiful locations, and they got bought out by a real estate investment trust and to suck the value out of the real estate. And if you were to go to one of those restaurants today, compared to what it was like 20 years ago, it would feel like a completely different place. It had this culture and vibe that was just so wonderful. Not so anymore. It's just another corporate chain. And I got to tell you, that haunts me to this very day. If I had been smarter back at that time and helped pull their best thinking about leadership out of them, as opposed to giving them mine, I think things for that organization would be different today. So was that CEO in the camp of the 55% plus that were dissatisfied with their investment in leadership development? Absolutely. How could it be anything other than that, right? Now, the second organization, and this proves the case, and it's been proved multiple times since then, was completely transformed. In just over 3 years, they evolved from what was a pretty siloed, internally competitive organization that was a distant number 2 in their marketplace to a cohesive, collaborative organization that's a strong number 1 in the marketplace. And one of the ways they got there, and this was, again, I don't take credit for this. This was a very visionary CEO, and he orchestrated a 4-way acquisition where his organization purchased 3 other hospitals and about half a dozen medical groups in their marketplace to consolidate this real large regional player. And when he came to me and he said, here's what I want to do to get this new culture right, is let's build a new model of leadership for this newly merged organization, and let's get all the CEOs and all the middle managers from all 3 or 4 organizations together, and let's create new, fresh perspective on what's going to be the right way to lead for this newly merged organization to form this new culture. And to this day, it is the best merger integration I've ever seen. I've had a chance to be involved in a lot of them. And so now if somebody comes to me and says, can you help me integrate a merger? The first thing I suggest to them is let's build a leadership model based on the unique perspectives of this newly merged management team. And that success story has been replicated many times over the years. And what it's proven to me is that no 2 organizations' leadership models are remotely similar. We've had a number of hospital clients over the years that have done leadership development. And for most kind of external views, Hospital A and Hospital B are pretty much the same thing. But you go inside them, and the people leading them, the people who are employed there, the markets they serve, are all unique. The competitors they fight against are all unique, and therefore the approach to leadership behaviors are also unique. And it's that dynamic that has really transformed the way I think leadership development should best be done by moving it away from the expert model of I've got something as leadership expert I want to teach you to this intrinsic model of let's pull what you think is best for you based on your perceptions of the kind of organization you want to be, the kind of people you've got, the kind of business circumstances you deal with. What's best for you is unique to you. So I just said those things. No one best way to lead, and what's best is unique to each organization. And just evidence after evidence after evidence with clients over the years continues to prove this out in my experience. So that leaves us with the third question of does what's best change over time? And I want to answer that question, I want to take you back to the story I just told you about that hospital system with the merger and how we use the leadership development process, its intrinsic process of leadership development, to create a paradigm of the new organization. And what causes the articulation of what's best over time to change are changing business circumstances. So you take that merged organization, and it used to be one hospital, one medical group. Now it was 4 hospitals and like 7 medical groups in 3 different geographies. Their business, different competitors. They were completely different business circumstances, which dictated a completely different way to lead. They were dealing with completely different, competitor profiles and all sorts of things, and therefore their approach to leadership needed to change. So what's best for an organization needs to be tailored to those business circumstances that they're dealing with at that point in time. And that's kind of the critical dynamic, is the fluidity of best leadership based on the fluidity of business circumstances. So as those circumstances change, behaviors change accordingly. We've talked about that. And that second organization, that hospital system, over the 12 years that they did this leadership development process with us, they went through 3 different models. They had the original model that we worked on. They had the model for the new merged organization. And about 4 years after that, as they began to really solidify their position in the marketplace and became really the preeminent player in their industry and their market, they had to change again because they had gotten a little bit stagnant, weren't quite as entrepreneurial. And the CEO wanted to turbocharge entrepreneurialism at that point in time, not get too bureaucratic, is kind of how things had evolved. And so they had a third model that evolved over time. So here's some key takeaways of the things that we've talked about. Is the best way to lead is really intrinsic to each organization. Every organization is different, even if they kind of look the same from the outside. Again, hospital A, hospital B. The process to define what is best must deeply engage the management team to bring out that intrinsic uniqueness. The change I had to make in my mind is I had to disconnect myself from the identity I was setting myself up for as a, quote, leadership expert, and move away from that expertise and instead hold myself out as a catalyst for the best thinking of that management team. And they were the experts about what was best for leadership in their organization, not me. And then the third key takeaway is what is best changes over time as the organization's circumstances change. Leadership is not a static thing. It's something that evolves and is fluid, just as business circumstances evolve and are fluid. So thanks, Tremendous. We're going to get to some questions here because there's quite a few of them that have popped up. But I encourage you at any point in time, contact me with my email. We can discuss however much depth you want to discuss on any of this stuff. To learn more about our consulting services and kind of how we approach things, you can go to iosiconsulting.com. And if you want to learn more about this licensing thing that we do, go to consultfromstrength.com. And that brings us to questions. So the first question here is what research indicates this level of CEO dissatisfaction? The 55% comes from a study that Korn Ferry did. And Korn Ferry, after their acquisition of Senn Delaney, is the largest leadership development consulting firm in the world by some measures. And their study says that over 55% of CEOs are dissatisfied with their leadership development investment. And then a very recent McKinsey study puts that number at 93%. Now, based on my own anecdotal experience talking to CEOs, I think the McKinsey number is pretty close to accurate. And what's so dangerous about that is it's caused a lot of organizations to just walk away from any effort on leadership development because, hey, it doesn't work. And those of you who are involved in this business know what a danger that is, what a lost opportunity that is. And I just want to see us turn that perspective around as an industry. Another question is, what if the CEO has a leadership expert they really admire and want to use in their model of leadership? Yeah, I've had that question come up a lot of times in the work I do with clients, and you embrace it. But you don't embrace it as the answer. You embrace it as an additional piece of perspective that helps craft the answer for that organization. Like a classic example of that is we had a client that was really into to John Kotter's book on leading change. John Kotter from Harvard. It's a great book. Nothing you could argue with. But as opposed to that becoming the model, because this was an organization going through a lot of change and wanted to figure out how do we get leaders to help guide us through this change and keep evolving with future change, is we just pulled middle management perspective, senior management perspective, frontline employee perspective, and John Kotter perspective into the mix as we were working to develop an intrinsic and unique model for that place. So you embrace it, you pull it in as a piece of perspective, but not as the answer. Another question here is, what's necessary for the transformation to take place? Yeah, that's a real good question too. A couple of fundamental things. First of all, and we've talked about this a lot this morning, is the answer needs to come from the team. So there's ownership. So I like that team to include at least the best people from middle management and then the entire senior team to get their perspectives hardwired into the model of leadership, so they have authorship and therefore ownership. There's another fundamental as well, and it's every bit as important, and that is the CEO themselves has to be committed to personally evolving their own leadership style consistent with that model. The very small number of times I've seen this process not work, not stick for the long haul, is when we've had circumstances where the CEO stopped believing that they also had to evolve with the rest of the management team. If that breaks down, it breaks the credibility chain in the organization. So all other leaders look up and they don't see the CEO themselves embracing the same behaviors that they're being asked to embrace. The whole thing falls apart. So the CEO has to be fully committed over time to continue to change and evolve, just like the rest of management's being asked to change and evolve. What types of circumstances would cause a need to change the model? Well, there's that merge thing I shared with you. Anytime business fundamentals change, and it could be things as simple as, we were once chasing a competitor, now we've surpassed that competitor. What's new about our dynamic now? Or the industry has changed fundamentally. The customer base demands different things. Price flexibility is constrained, and that has to change. Basically, anytime business circumstances change, competitors change, you've hired a bunch of new people, you've gone through a layoff, you've gone through an acquisition, you've experienced financial change, and it could be financial change up or down. Because climbing up the ladder of improvement is just as shaky as falling down the ladder. Things have to change when you're improving financially or declining financially. So just any fundamental business change is a time to stop and think, do we have to teach leaders to act a little different way? This is great. A completely corollary question. Next one here is, how frequently do models usually need to change? I've found that even if nothing radical has happened in an organization to require a review of a leadership model, is I like to look at them and take stock of them at least every 3 to 4 years, no longer than that, and probably closer to 3. Just to sit down with middle management, sit down with the senior team and go, okay, here's our model. Are these still the most important things we want leaders to do? Because if you think of the huge array of leadership tips and skills and competencies that you've all seen out there over the years. I mean, there's literally hundreds of them, right? Well, we're talking about leadership models here that might have 6, 8, 10 core behaviors we want leaders to embrace. So these are tightly prioritized models. So we need to look of all the different things leaders could be doing. What's the tight priority set now? So I like to look at that every 3 to 4 years, and probably closer to 3 than to 4. Let's see. What would cause an organization to stop this type of leadership development process? Budget stops it sometimes. I think it's incumbent on all of us in this industry to keep doing things to the best of our ability, to keep our fees as reasonable as possible, to minimize that problem, because organizations need this work, very badly. I found that CEO changeover is a common stopper as well. Because again, if you go back to the point I made earlier about what makes this stuff work, CEO commitment, well, that's a very deep ownership that the CEO is taking in a completely different, counterintuitive, and counter-conventional way to approach leadership development. It isn't often that when a CEO leaves an organization, a new one's brought in, that they have that same belief. It's happened a few times, but it's common that in that CEO transition, a project will stop. And there's another dynamic that causes this to stop sometimes that actually relates to something I think we can do better from a leadership development standpoint. And it's when the priorities in an organization get too voluminous. They're focused on too many things, and I can't even think about this anymore. I think we kind of have the leadership stuff. We're okay with that. Let's put it on a shelf for a while because we don't have to think about it anymore, because we have so many other priorities going on. Here's what I've learned about that is if an organization has had enough time with a model and really been committed to it, really engaged in the development of people on it, is you can probably take about 18 months off without reinforcing it with additional assessment processes and educational processes. But after that 18-month point, people start to revert back to old styles and very individual styles of leadership, and that commonality of leadership begins to fade away. And if an organization doesn't really continue to be discerning about what their key priorities are, including involving leadership development as a key priority, they'll get the effort and focus will get diffused and they'll pull away. So one of the things I like to do with my clients is engage with them in some pretty aggressive strategic prioritization and help them think about how can they continue to carve time to focus on the continued effort of leadership development, so they don't ever put it on a shelf for too long and lose the value of it. Last question here. Do you think the restaurant company would have been successful if you had used the intrinsic approach with them? When I talk about this haunting me, it's because I believe the answer to that question is an unequivocal yes. And I can't even explain today why I didn't go back. I told you I had sold the assignment with the hospital company. Now, we had never started it. And I went back and I unsold it and came up with this intrinsic approach. Why didn't I do that with the restaurant company? I'm not sure. In retrospect, 2020 hindsight, it appeared to be working so well, and I didn't want to mess with it. But again, we probably all in our consulting careers, if those of you who are consultants, if you're an executive, probably in your management career, have a few decisions you've made that haunt you. No, this is one of mine. I completely believe that company could have been transformed. It might be different to this very day if I had taken a different approach, that intrinsic approach to leadership, as opposed to, hey, I'm a smart guy and here's my expert approach. That was a stupid move on my part. It really was. It was ignorant on my part, and I should have changed it. Thanks for asking the question, because it's important. And they could have continued to be successful. I'm quite confident of that. So that's all the questions. I want to thank you tremendously for your time, and we'll have another webinar coming out soon. I'd like to do them every 3 or 4 weeks or so, and hopefully you can hop in on that one too. So thanks again. I wish you all the best out there.